Okay, so tonight I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about Gestalt theory, and it comes about in kind of an unusual way, and it also sort of builds off of the video I made the other day about AI interlocutors and how flawed they are in terms of our being able to bully them and narrow our prompts to have the AI say whatever we want it to say. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, again, I've mentioned reality tunnels, right? Like how we put information together is dependent on our context and how we've developed a model of how we see the world that it makes sense. And so we take in new information and then we fit it in to the model that we have. And different people, their models have different levels of maybe complexity, shall we say, and it depends on what the sources of information are that they're taking in and how much of a feedback loop they have from different siloed information sources. And I'm not saying good, bad, indifferent, whatever. I'm just saying that's how it works. And I'm a bit of a weirdo because for the last 10 years, I've been pulling threads and making connections and making maps, hundreds of which get erased by little sis and open society. And then I start again and I make more maps. And even if the maps get erased, I have in my head sort of a framework of how I see things fitting together. And I'm not saying it's any more or less correct than the people operating in different silos. It's just because of my life circumstances, because I worked part-time. I had an older child that was pretty self-sufficient, or at least I thought at the time. And then so I had time to do civic activism. And then it turns out that the place that I worked seemed to be weirdly intersecting with some of these different strange cybernetic governance programs in ways that are just kind of ridiculous some days. I've made these maps. And so the way I see the world is very different from the way a lot of other people see the world. And so this idea of Gestalt that I came across again today, because I was thinking back through Christiana Figueres, who was sort of, one of the main people in the UN climate programs and developed this idea of the carbon exchange. She grew up in Costa Rica, and her father was the president of Costa Rica, I think 3 times over. And she, as a young woman, she went to college at Swarthmore, which is a Quaker college outside of Philadelphia. And it's interesting because Swarthmore is very Quaker, and they also sort of very much embody the social justice rapport. Only maybe not all, that's overstating, but many, when I went to an open house there once when we were doing school looking around, a very large majority of their student body that was part of this presentation, they all wanted to go work for the IMF and the World Bank and be economists in the global, for social justice, that's that sort of thing. And I always found that it's a little bit mind-boggling. And so I realized that Swarthmore is another part of this Quaker part of the story. And it's very interesting that the woman who was sort of the public spearhead behind the carbon exchange trading through the UN climate program went to Swarthmore. And what's interesting is, so evidently her father had been married previously and divorced and then married her mother. But the first wife, her name was Henrietta Boggs, and Henrietta met Christiana Figueres' dad, who became the president, when she was visiting her uncle and aunt in Costa Rica from Alabama, because Henrietta is from Alabama. And it turns out in the late 1950s, a whole bunch of Quakers moved from Alabama and set up shop in Costa Rica and set up a lot of the infrastructure for sort of pacifist, green, eco-friendly, yada yada, like intentional community. So the first wife had this, I don't know if she was directly Quaker, but she was visiting her friends, her relatives, aunt and uncle, who were Quaker and part of this early settlement in the 50s in Costa Rica of the Quakers. So we've got the Quaker overlap, and then Christiana goes to Swarthmore, which is, I'm sure many people in Central America, study in the United States, that's not too strange, but, Swarthmore, definitely a Quaker school there. And there was a connection. He didn't actually teach there, but I think a lot of his papers were there, and he had an honorary professorship for at least 1 year in the 80s which was after Figueres would have been there, or maybe just at the cusp. Maybe she had just graduated, but Kenneth Boulding. Kenneth Boulding was a Quaker. He was an economist. He initiated a lot of the early sort of social impact framework, and also this idea of the Earth as a spaceship Earth, which wasn't strictly his idea, but he was one of the big promoters of that. And then his wife, Elise, also Quaker, became a major a professor and an important person in sociology around peace studies. And so she was an innovative person in peace studies. So, and Kenneth was the economist around peace and sort of like social homeostasis and the early circular economy types of stuff. And for many years he taught at Michigan, and then towards the end of their careers, they both moved to the University of Colorado Boulder. And so there's a lot of peace activism there. And again, I'm not anti-peace. I just don't think most people understand it as organismic homeostasis tied to spatial computing and token engineering. And that's the part that I'm not comfortable with. So I'm going to pause here for a second and turn on a light because it's getting dark. I think that should be good as the sun goes down. I'm here in my cozy sunroom, which is warmer than expected today. It was maybe in the 50s here, which is super. There's only a tiny little bit of snow left. And I actually could have my heat off all day, which was awesome. And I have been, just as an aside, I have like along the house there is some little planter beds. So my cilantro survived the 11 inches of snow, as did my arugula. So when I get done recording this, I'm going to make myself I made some pizza dough the other day, so I'm going to have a ricotta and arugula white pizza with some garlic, including I think some from that Sean had sent to me. And I've been busy doing some handwork. You can see my embroidery stuff. And so I'm making like little quilt things and just keeping myself entertained. This is like a little girl with some dandelions. So anyway, when I'm not doing research, I'm cooking and quilting and doing embroidery. So that is what's keeping me busy in this sort of cozy hibernation time. And I'm glad because I thought I was getting a cold yesterday, but I went to bed early and I'm feeling much better today. So anyway, that's sort of just newsy stuff. But anyway, back to Christiana Figueres and the Quakers and Costa Rica and carbon trading and Gestalt. So if you Google Christiana Figueres, and the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, some stuff will come up. Now, I had put this down years ago in her entry when I was focusing on the UN SDGs, and just for the record, just because I'm talking about this, and if someone dumps this transcript into AI, I'm not advocating any of these things. I just think they're important to know about, and I want to put them forward for people's consideration. I am not co-signing this. So if you're anybody like, Mr. Substack man who wants to imply somehow like Klaus Schwab has little me down in Hot Springs, Arkansas on speed dial to plot out the newest circular economy program, that would be false. I'm simply saying that there are other things that we should be talking about besides pandemic preparedness or whatever the things that a lot of people are still fixated on. So for me, it's Gestalt theory. And I wanted to understand it because Christiana Figueres attended the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland and was studying organizational dynamics and systems theory. I don't know how back in the day, after she graduated college. And I thought, oh, how interesting, right? Systems design, right? Because really for the past 2 or 3 years at this point, I've really been focused on systems and systems constraints. And so what is Gestalt? Well, one, note that it's Cleveland. So Cleveland, of course, is the sort of the haven for all things or many things Rockefeller. And then Ohio as a whole has its own things going on with, Dayton and Akron and Battelle and National Cash Register and all the atomic energy installations in World War II and the Mississippian builder mounds and all of that stuff. There's a lot going on in Ohio and particularly in Cleveland. So the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland is interesting, especially given the hand in hand between Rockefeller and the United Nations, both the construction of the United Nations in New York, as well as the ongoing relationship of the Rockefeller Foundation with the deployment and development of the Sustainable Development Goals. So Gestalt was initially developed by a German psychoanalyst by the name of Fritz Perls. Probably he's a pretty common name for people who know about such things. He became later in his life associated with Esalen. He was influenced early on by Wilhelm Reich. So a lot of the stuff about organismic energy, right? That sort of thing. And also Kurt Lewin. And Kurt Lewin was another German, I guess, social scientist, systems theorist. And he came and he spent time teaching at MIT. And he had connections to Tavistock. So both interested in organizational design. And I think at this point, it really behooves us to look at things as organisms, right? Because as we move forward with Web3 tokenization, we're going to be dealing a lot more with this idea of DAOs, decentralized autonomous organizations. But of course, I think there is a certain resonance between a DAO and Taoism and animism, and this sort of Whiteheadian idea of everything being becoming an animist aspect of humans in the environment, and being advanced in this sort of climate change narrative-driven post-Anthropocene milieu that we're all being subjected to in various ways. So Fritz Perls helped develop Gestalt. The idea was about organismic self-regulation. So again, think homeostat, world homeostat, and Ervin Laszlo. Now, there's a couple of aspects that Gestalt is used in. One is organizational dynamics. And I think we can, the more and more I think about it, a lot of business post-World War II organizational management theory is really the foundation upon which the DAO framework will be built. And the predatory capitalism aspect, which I don't say isn't true, it is true, but the system as a whole has the next step planned, which is the networked commons, right? The network state. And this will be connected as commoning, and it will be this pool. And then this will be defined as holons, these different units. And those holons will have their own identities with semi-permeable boundaries. And that those boundaries will be defined with token engineering. And each of all of us, both humans and non-humans, will be identified with digital identities and become agents in various problem-solving simulated gaming environments. And then it will be dynamic. And so there'll be really little ones and then really big ones, and it will scale at different levels. And a lot of this will be mediated through AI. And so it's sort of about this intelligence eventually at a global level, right? And whether you want to call it, the noosphere, Gaia, there's a lot of different names for, the age of Aquarius. We're all going to have like our opening awareness, and we're all going to be interconnected with Web3 tokens. I think that's where things are going, is that we are going to start losing our boundaries, but not entirely. We're not going to disappear. We're going to have these semi-permeable boundaries of the self. But some aspect of the self will always stay intact. And then it's a matter of orchestrating through various energetic flow states an optimization of the agents towards some sort of teleology, some sort of function that is not clear to me. I think whoever is engineering the overall system has an idea of what they want the goals to be accomplished. Well, clearly the UN SDGs are, the most forward-facing goals, but it's not just about those particular 17 goals. It's going to be some other things that I think have to do with information processing. So the fact that Perls was influenced by Lewin was at MIT, and again, MIT was the center later on with the Digital Currency Initiative, and I'm trying to remember. Brian Ford, I think was his name. He was a Peace Corps guy in Nicaragua, so we've got the Central America connection too, and his wife was part of, indigenous law and gaming law. And so we've got these digital token things like baked in from the beginning in terms of the organismic homeostasis as a system, So the organism as a system. And then an organism could be any size group, right? Like your body is a group of different components. And then you are a group within a family unit. And then your family unit is a group within a neighborhood. And there's all these different scales of groups that are all imagining some sort of homeostatic balance towards some sort of preferred optimized state. And so we're always like, essentially, all of this is incumbent on people in the environment. And if you go back and you look at the UN and UNESCO's work, it was always humans in the environment. So it's an agent in its context. And we assess our position in the context through our sensory mechanisms, right? Through the 5 senses. And if you're gifted and you have some bonus extra senses, maybe you have some extra senses you can throw in the mix, but we're constantly either consciously or unconsciously mediating our bodies. Like I went and got a blanket because I knew once the sun went down it would get cold. This is me having a goal-oriented behavior and planning, and then sensing so that I won't get chilly while I'm probably going to end up talking more than I wanted to talk. So it's, you make sense of your environment and then you act within that according to what your goals are to optimize your state condition that you want, which is me not to be chilly. So what Gestalt does is, so there's Gestalt theory, and then there's Gestalt also applied to design. And so it's about perception. How do we perceive? Often it's a visual perception is a lot of what the examples are. And they talk about the idea of like, how do you take in sensory information, see patterns, and then figure out how to act in relation to those patterns. And oftentimes it's short. You know, I've talked a lot about the reality tunnel and Carl Friston's free energy principle, and we have these models, but if we were like overthinking everything all the time, we'd like burn out our energy budget. So we don't do that. We just pay attention, and we take a lot of shortcuts. And sometimes when we take shortcuts, things are turn out to be not exactly what we thought at first glance. And there's all sorts of psychology experiments where they show that people's perceptions are often not accurate. And so this has all been baked in going back, like Lewin was connected like to Tavistock, and a lot of these psychoanalyst people, they were dealing in clinical settings with big groups of traumatized soldiers in the post-World War II era. And often because there were so many traumatized people and it was a cultural time in which they acknowledged the trauma, they didn't have enough therapists to do one-on-one therapy, so they would do group therapy. And so it was sort of how to work within a group environment, the group being an organism, to, I guess, address group dynamics and trauma. And then all of that gets applied to like management theory later on in the, go 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. But they learned a lot of this on World War II trauma and these therapists that were coming out of World War II trauma. So it's like, how do you properly take in information, find a pattern, and assess it? And so some of these ideas of perception actually are incorporated deeply into design philosophies. And if you think of, the whole post-World War II materialist, capitalist, consumer goods oriented, advertising, hard sell culture, it made a lot of sense because, I was a kid who grew up in the 70s and 80s, and how many of us from that era can like recite jingles, advertising jingles, or how many of us like know the logos? These logos, they use Gestalt principles. And so this idea is like taking in the whole as a unit as opposed to parsing all the different parts. And so I guess the reason I wanted to talk to you about this today, well, I'll mention a few of them. Okay, so it's looking at the pattern. It's often simplifying something. It is looking at things that are in proximity to one another. It's also looking at commonality, so that if most everything is doing one thing and there's one oddball thing that's doing something else, you don't notice the thing that's doing something else. You just really notice the whole doing one particular thing. You notice emergent patterns, so you see the pattern as a whole instead of parsing the individual parts. You can do closure, which is filling in parts that are missing, but your eye knows how to fill in the rest. Like if you think about the IBM logo, when it was all the little lines for the I and the B and the M, they were stripy lines, but you could tell what the point was, that it was an I, it was a B and an M, even though they were all separated by parallel lines of alternating colors. Your brain would fill in that closure. And And so there were two things that were sort of about optical illusions and how the mind can hold two different perceptions, and that you can't actually hold both of them at once. You have to alternate back and forth. So one of them was about invariance. And they used the optical illusion that often we've seen, which is like, which is it? Is it the beautiful young lady in the hat, or is it the old crone with the big nose, right? It was, so you look at an image and you can see the young woman, or you can see the old crone, but you can't see them at the same time. So that's maybe that's not an invariance. That's seeing the same thing from different perspectives. Sorry, that's a different thing. Multi-stability, I think, is that. And then there's figure and ground, which is the optical illusion where you would see like the vase that was actually two profiles facing each other. So you would either see the two people facing each other, or you would see the goblet in between. But you couldn't hold them both at once. And so what I wanted to sort of mention, why I bring this all up today about Gestalt, is that I was leaving a comment on, I don't usually look at this unlimited hangout, but I was just kind of curious, and I went over and that guy, John Kleizek, he had another one up about Barbara Marx Hubbard and depopulation, and I was kind of frustrated, and so I left a comment, and I was curious if they actually were going to release my comment, and they did, so credit to them for that. But I noticed that they have two recent articles, and I don't know if maybe Whitney Webb is not writing as much anymore, if she's probably busy with her kids or whatever, but one by Max Jones. This was the first one I saw, and he's a young guy. I guess he's a new writer over there. CDC, Palantir, and the AI healthcare revolution. And then more recently, I guess today, Mark Goodwin, the ex-editor of Bitcoin, he had this evolution of militarized data brokers and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to sort of point out this idea of the optical illusion of the faces and the goblet. And, you know, both of these are pretty long articles, and they have a lot of information in them that is accurate. And again, I've gone through my phase where I was really centered on intelligence and the military. You know, that's where I was early on in my education technology days, and coming to the realization that the Chromebooks in the classrooms were a problem. I mean, this was me in like 2015. You know, and I kind of fell for the Edward Snowden thing, even though, like, again, these are all whistleblowers or all partial truths. But in looking through both of these articles, you know, it's interesting because, again, you've got the figure and the ground, right? The goblet and the faces. It's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. They're both there. But I feel like all of these people going back to Gestalt and understanding how to manage perception, how to deploy our mind to fill in the blanks, right? To look at things, to look for simplicity, to look for proximity. Like, they're talking about that in terms of designing, like things like logos or graphics. But I think it can also very much be used within the context of ideas and group dynamics. So part of the Gestalt group psychotherapy practice was looking at making yourself more self-aware. So again, being an agent, looking at yourself in relation to others within a group, applying systems theory and group dynamics to the Gestalt aspect. So again, it's being aware of you as an agent within your relationship to other people, and their differing perspectives, their different lived experiences, and then imagining that these groups were had their own internal dynamics. And this is maybe more applied in a management setting, but that the goal would be to have a group system that would reinforce the positive aspects and to explore different routes to solving problems. I think he called it equifinality, to sort of push back on entropy, by everyone contributing food for thought, that it would be a negentropic system that would hold itself together, and that these systems would have semi-permeable boundaries. So your identity would be semi-permeable within the group in terms of your engagement in the group. And so I think they are imagining that these Gestalt groups, maybe not as much in a psychotherapeutic context, although maybe in that context it would be about helping resolve the trauma of various individuals, but I think more of in a group management context of optimizing the productivity of a given group. Again, within the complex emergent that you would become self-aware enough and aware enough of the process that you would, the group itself would be more productive than the individuals by themselves. And then that would be a negentropic thing, which was kind of connected to that like Ilya Prigogine guy down in Austin. So looking for negentropy in group dynamics. And that's something like that Kurt Lewin was connecting to. And then also within the group, they would look at norms, roles, and group development. So group evolution. And to me, they did mention the connection with cybernetics or second order cybernetics, that the group would have engagement and then feedback into the group again, and then the next round. And so that this would be a cybernetic system within the group dynamics. And so I'm thinking of all of this in the context, again, of the carbon trading and the circular economy and emergent complex systems and the idea of digital identity and agent-based modeling. And I'm not saying that this is good, but I'm saying like the discussion that's being had over at Unlimited Hangout, I would say is, say we'll call it the silhouettes, and what I'm trying to point out is the vase, right? So the silhouettes would be, okay, we're dealing with digital identity. We're dealing with scary things like militarism. We're dealing with planned depopulation targeting at-risk communities. We're dealing with surveillance of data by scary Silicon Valley. And all of those things are accurate. I'm not disputing that those, and the me of like 5 years ago would have been all over that. And you can look back at my blog and see kind of the evolution there. But what I'm realizing is if what you're watching in between the CDC and Palantir and AI healthcare and these militarized data brokers, there are things that are not being said that I think are highly important and relevant in this Make America Healthy Again scenario. And so what I would offer is that if you think about the attention token economy as these carbon tokens, right? They don't have to be carbon. Again, and I'm bringing this up because Christiana Figueres, who went to the Gestalt Institute in Cleveland, studied organizational theory there and this idea of Gestalt. So both how do you work with how people perceive things and how they work as individuals and groups. And those tokens are signals. This is what I keep trying to convey to people. It's not that they're necessarily, you shouldn't just limit it to money or you shouldn't just limit it to carbon. It's a coordinating signal mechanism. And most of the people who are down at ETH Denver and whatever, they know that that's what it is. They talk about that a lot. So, so how would we apply that to something like a Substack situation, right? These people have been working on this since the 40s and 50s. I mean, this is not new territory. We're gearing in on 75 years worth of expertise and tons of money, because the amount of money going into cultural anthropology and psychology and organizational theory through the military is just through the roof. Like most of these academics are paid. So yes, militarism, but maybe it looks a little differently than what you think. And so if we're focused on, as Max Jones and Mark Goodwin are, on the threat being, this is about big pharma, this is about the military, this is about the deep state. This is about a takeover of the internet for something scary. But we're not really going to go into wellness, managed wellness. We're not really going to go into Medicare. We're not really going to go into telehealth. We're not really going to talk about, and for me, this is key, the issue with Palantir and its connections. A lot of times the focus is on overt military action, things like drones or military defense department contracts. What to me is much more compelling, and again, I'm offering the Vase perspective, not to say that the silhouette perspective is not valid and documented and worthwhile to consider, but there's something in between that is right there in front of you that isn't being said. And this is what I'm trying to fill in this gap and say, how do we balance the two perspectives? Is that this vase that's in the gap is pay for success finance attached to managed wellness. And I know this because one of my very first series, I had a friend who lives in Silicon Valley and was often in meetings where early on where things were being discussed around pay for success finance. And in the context of education spaces. But those early contracts in Santa Clara County not only had to do with children and education, but it had to do with homeless individuals, and that was attached to housing and mental health. And in these pay for success finance deals, and again, this is social impact finance and social impact bonds, you need a deal evaluator to make it fair and trustworthy. And the deal evaluators for both of those were Palantir in coordination with University of California, San Francisco. And so Palantir's connection to cybernetic governance and I mean, there was a brief mention of the welfare system in these articles, but not in any detail, right? They weren't talking about the idea of doing tokenized nudges with food stamps. They weren't talking about putting babies on blockchain connected to global aid systems. There were a lot of things that were left out. And so Palantir moved to Denver. Denver and Colorado are, and Jason and I did site visits there, and I can put in the pinned comments the two videos that we did specifically about Colorado and their pay for success infrastructure and the role of Palantir relocating to Denver. It matters. This stuff really actually does matter. At this point, Palantir isn't Silicon Valley anymore. It's Colorado. And Colorado is blockchain. And blockchain was never hijacked, Mr. Bitcoin, Mark Goodwin. It was always for cybernetic governance. And the cybernetic governance system goes at least back to the Macy conferences, right? This is nothing new. Didn't just happen. And so if what you're doing is you're presenting this artificial intelligence as a military operation that has, a side of depopulation in it, and some surveillance, but the surveillance is generally the implication is it's a top-down control system. And what I would argue, and I keep having issues with people around the control aspect, is that until you understand emergence and complexity and enabling constraints, and very few people seem capable of actually devoting any time to self-educating themselves on these topics, even though I'm pretty exhaustive about it. And I do have people just tell me, well, I just don't have time. There's too many other things that are on my plate to think about. This isn't easy. And you actually, and this is what I'm realizing about the Gestalt stuff and how everything is, how I'm trying to say this, I should not be surprised that it doesn't stick, because Gestalt theory says that people want to simplify patterns. Now, if we mix this idea with the inherent need for us to find simple answers, this is not a simple answer. In order to deal with what I'm talking about, there's probably at least a half dozen schools of thought that you have to get under your belt. Everything from finance to philosophy to signals intelligence and electrical engineering. Now, it's not to say you can't do it, because I did it and I didn't know any of these things. My background is in freaking art history. But I did it because it was important to me to do it. But it's not simple. And people really look for simple, and that's why they live in a reality tunnel, because they find a spot where they're cozy, and then they just sit in a tunnel and listen to people who say the things over and over and over again that make them comfortable in their tunnel. And that's simple. The other thing is this idea of commonality, that you look to see where the herd is going. I'm going the other direction. I'm not going with the herd. So it doesn't show up, because they had in the graphic design section a whole bunch of arrows that were all one way and one arrow going this way. I'm that one. So this is not surprising. The idea of proximity, which things are close to each other. And I would say apply this to these social media feeds and things like Substack, right? If Lewin is talking about systems theory and group dynamics, look at these Substacks that get so many comments, right? And this idea that within those are communities. Those are holons. Those are psychological twins. Those are these big Substacks are organisms. And the comments that are commenting on them are units under the umbrella of that superorganism. And so they're developing their own norms and their own roles, and they're evolving. So these groups are evolving. And if you think for 1 minute that these larger systems analysis, intelligence systems are not mining that for everything it's worth to understand how these units of Substack evolve, I mean, you're very naive. Like, you actually don't understand anything about the game. And, I would say what I've seen in a few of them is that there is this reinforcement of trauma. And I don't know about you. I'm not really on. I don't listen to the news, and I don't get a newspaper. Where I am now, and maybe you can blame me for being checked out, but nobody's talking about public health stuff. No, that's not anything that is affecting my life whatsoever. My life is pretty okay, and that's not something. But if you look on Substack, you would think that the people who are living there are all living in the middle of reliving over and over and over this trauma that will never get resolved, because there's not an incentive for it to be resolved, because a lot of the people who have essentially built their income streams on re-traumatizing people and grouping people according to the trauma will never be able to move on. And I would say that's part of my concern with the overall therapeutic modality. Like, these are sort of group therapy sessions, these Substacks in the comment sections now. They're group therapy and reinforcement. And, it's one thing to acknowledge what happened and that things that happened were harmful. But if you can't get to the point that you can make your peace with it and move forward, you're just going to stagnate till you die. And you're already in the hell that you've made in your mind that you think is coming, because you're already there. And so, I'm just very, very suspicious of the attention token economy and what all of this means. And again, I went out to Rockfin, which is, where all of these early influencers were, and in Austin, and, was talking about the fact that there are problems. There's problems with this dynamics, but it does go back to Gestalt and how they're looking at these evolving groups. And so, so if you're looking for proximity, right, they're always suggesting maybe you like this Substack, maybe you like this Substack, or, go back and answer this comment, or this person replied on your comment. So it's keeping everything very close in contiguous, right? Things that seem similar and symmetry. So things that are outside the norm of what you would expect are not going to make it into before your eyeballs. They're not going to make it to you, because the entire system is set up to keep you feeling like you're making progress and getting new information and that you're a superior person, all the while keeping you in a certain segment of the internet and keeping your view of the world in a very certain limited way. And, and I'm not saying this is any different. I'm not going around I'm here. I do get frustrated that we still have so little meaningful engagement on the things that I'm talking about at this point. I mean, how many people can come in and say, oh, I don't really know anything about Web3. Is that important? And I'm like, well, if you're here and most of these videos are getting over 1,000 views, Web3 is important. It actually is. And I can tell you how I feel about it, but you actually have to learn it enough that you can have your own opinion about it. I'm not here to tell you how to think about it. I'm here to introduce ideas that are important to consider. And as you're consuming this information in these second-order cybernetic systems that keep you looped in the token attention economy, what's happening with Gestalt is really important. Like, who are you within that group? What is your identity? What's the pecking order? Who are the cliques? All cliques with the QU, yes, right? Who are the popular kids? All of this stuff is being very managed, right? And so in that respect, this idea of surveillance that's being offered at Unlimited Hangout is correct. It is surveillance, but it's not just, you don't have to just worry about the hospital system and your healthcare portal. Like, your people are self-participating in it already, right? It's already there. It's just, this is a new iteration of it. And yeah, it is concerning. But what was missing for me in these two elements, nothing about Web3, nothing about how this relates to make America healthy again, nothing about wellness metrics, nothing about the shift to telehealth. It was about hospitals, and again, what I was talking about, tokenized faith, a lot of the faith communities are integrated into social welfare. And one of the big areas is hospital systems. I mean, look in your community. How many hospital systems are associated with the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, the Lutheran Church? A lot of these hospital systems have, maybe when you walk in, you don't notice it, but it's there. These church groups are embedded in the health system. And then eventually the hospital as a physical presence is going to start to fall into the background, and you're going to end up with, the minute clinics at Walmart and your phone and your telehealth providers. And that's something, again, within the lockdown circumstance, the so-called resistance, they were all in that space. They're like, here's get a subscription and you can have a consult with our, health consultants that align with your worldview. They weren't against telehealth. They were raw telehealth, all of them. So, in a lot of these are alternative practice people, and they're like, here, let me do remote healing with you, why don't we all do our meditation on Zoom? Why don't we do all these things? This needs to be baked in. So if what you're focused on is pandemic planning, like your public health thing is pandemic, and again, that's not to say that they don't put out these articles so that you can pick it up and talk about it. Yeah, they want you to talk about it. But this is the second winter, and don't you think if we've gone through 2 consecutive seasons and they haven't done the thing again, not to say they're never going to do it, but that's not their go-to thing anymore. Their go-to thing with Mr. Bobby is wellness. And so you need to look at Esther Dyson and her Ways to Wellville programs, right? You need to look at Julian Gresser and the tokenized community wellness and big heart intelligence and the cardioverse. There are things that you need to look at. You actually need to understand Web3. Yes, that's a start, and the token engineering and the behaviors. And yeah, PayPal is going to be behind that too. Because ultimately, if you imagine, like they talk a lot about the intelligence communities here and the military, but in my opinion, what this is about isn't a depopulation. It's not about turning you into a puppet. It's about turning you into an agent. It's not about doing top-down control and forcing you to do one particular thing. It's the Gestalt aspect of developing managed holons and getting emergent, interesting behavior out of them. Like that's the thing about these open systems is that there's something called, the equifinality, that there's no one right answer. Like there are many different adaptive routes to solving the problem. What I think is happening is that we are being tagged so that we can be grouped. And again, the tagging and the grouping is already happening. Like if you're active in these Substacks and these chat rooms or these Reddit things, you're already tagged. This is already, these digital twins are well underway. And clearly, I've already got a digital twin and supposedly I'm, Klaus Schwab's back pocket or something like that. It's crazy. If you talk to AI enough, you can make them say anything. But yeah, so this is already happening. And sure, now you can attach it to health. But I was talking about MyPass and blockchaining homeless people for their health records back in 2020. It's not new. So why are we still talking about it like this? And we're not saying, yes, AI healthcare has these military intelligence aspects, but it also isn't just the pandemic preparedness as the public health issue. It's going to be chronic illness, which is everything that Bobby Kennedy has said that he's there to do, especially for whom? Children, right? Because children are going to be the channels in this emergent creative economy where your intellectual property is tokenized and put on the blockchain for future use, right? Oh, we'll have all the children who are at Head Start with the We Play Smart surveillance play tables, and if they make like a really cool move manipulating the 2-dimensional diagrams in their surveillance play table, it'll go on the facial recognition smart board so that maybe when they're 30 and that cool move gets used in some whatever pattern recognition system, they get a micropayment. Like this is the stuff that we need to talk about. And so, I'm not here to say that there's not a utility in that. Right? I would just frame this as in the Gestalt, the figure and ground. They're presenting the figure, these, the 2 people in profile. And the vase is there, right? So the figures are the scary military pandemic surveillance story. And then the vase is the managed wellness through your local faith institutions and your insurance companies, the Kaiser Permanentes of the world, the Aetnas, and so on and so forth. And And while we're at that, about the insurance company money going into pay for success, again, not for chronic illness, right? And a lot of the chronic illness is going to be mental health, which will be your AI management chatbot, lifelong learning assistant, which, yeah, I'm sure PayPal will be integrated in that as well. But the insurance companies, and so just in terms of like the ontopoetics, you know, the last storm that came through, we got 11 inches of snow here, and it was called Cora. And there are these, you know, sort of signs that come up sometimes. And Cora, for me, it recalled a time at which I was working at Bartram's Garden, which is a public garden in Philadelphia. It's on the Schuylkill River. It was, 18th century garden surrounded by a lot of, it's a low-income area. The big refinery was across from us. A lot of environmental pollution. It was a low-income neighborhood. There was public housing next to us. And we were about 40 acres. It really was an amazing oasis. And during the summer, we would have outdoor movies. And one of those, one of the movies, I don't know if it was the year Black Panther came out, but if not, it was like the next year. But it was still a big deal. And we had these free movie nights for the neighborhood, which was predominantly, Black neighborhood and a lot of African immigrants too, in our zip code. And so one of our funders, who happened to be Aetna, they came with a big RV. It was a big purple RV, and they were going to offer body mass indicator measurements, the flab under your arm, and smoothies from their RV, and VR headset things. Now, at the time, I knew that virtual reality was a problem, and I said to Mike, we shouldn't be doing this, because even the VR headsets say that they shouldn't be used by children under the age of 13 because it can mess up your vestibular orientation. And also, honestly, it's just not hygienic with a bunch of people in public and a couple of sets of headsets. Everybody's sharing them around. It's just like having stuff on your face. It just, to me, it didn't seem right. And so they agreed that we wouldn't do the VR, and they did the other things. But those VR headsets were essentially for children to meditate in the jungle. And this is sort of getting back to Christiana Figueres and the carbon trading in the jungle. The rainforest, which Costa Rica is renowned for its rainforest, is a complex adaptive system, which is this Gestalt, these group dynamics. And so having inner city low-income kids, and this was a CHIP, this was their low-cost children's health insurance ban, was this Cora ban. And it was named Cora for corazon, which is the heart. And the woman who runs the van, and she was like so in love with her van. It was a big RV, big purple RV. And then they also had so one little room was that you could meditate in VR in, and then the other room had a Connect video game. And again, that's this motion. So I'm talking about motion capture and flow state and things like martial arts movements and stuff like that, and how this could be triggering and actually doing computational elements. And this is not so far off, because, UNICEF Innovation Fund, they were funding plans for gestural coding for kids in Nigeria. So this idea of doing movements and then having them mean something beyond what you actually think you're doing in a game is a real thing, sadly. And so, I was trying to talk with a couple of the people who were staffing it about these issues of like concierge healthcare. And I think at the time, like JP Morgan and Berkshire Hathaway were doing some sort of like new kinds of membership health benefits. And of course, we're going to be seeing soon like these health savings accounts, like the education vouchers. And then that's what's going to get into the alternative community, because a lot of the energy medicine, the biofield tuning, all of that is stuff that they want into the database system. Like, just look at the Emerald Gate Foundation, that's stuff that they want in. And clearly the people were really uncomfortable with that. And I wasn't trying to be difficult, but I was just really curious if they understood. And so this van was specifically targeting children, right? And, with the healthy eating and the BMI, and like, I wasn't going to get, they're like, oh, you should get it, and I'm, no, like, what is that about? Why are they, who invested in that big RV and for what purpose? And yeah, and Aetna was involved in Pay for Success. And, when I looked it up later, I was like, Aetna, that's an interesting name. And it actually is named for Mount Etna, the volcano. And when I was looking at the Peter Kingsley books, and I just started, but I didn't get too far into it, he was looking at these early Greek philosophers slash shamanic magicians, kind of, in southern Italy. And one of them was Empedocles. And Empedocles, I think, was one of the people who first came up with the idea of like the 4 elements. And he was trying to explain to people, and I think he's also like considered an early father of logic. Like he predates Aristotle in the idea of logic. And I guess he was having, and there was a poem, like a lot of these philosophers, they would write poetry. And so then there would be these poetic fragments that people would go back and try to make sense of what the poems were about. But evidently Empedocles kind of got fed up with the whole thing and decided to throw himself into a volcano, into Mount Etna. And I'm not like laughing, but it's an interesting, because I think the idea was that he would then become immortal. And so it's interesting because I did put up a shorter compilation of a woman in Wales who had her ideas about the cosmos being this dynamic torus field. And if you imagine like a volcano being the whole of the torus, talking about like the 2 black holes meeting and then having this burst of light, and then these different energy levels out to the outside, which is our reality, and that being heavy and then getting recycled back in, which to me, it seems to correspond at least somewhat to, as I understand, Joseph's idea about quantum realism, and then also Itzhak Bentov's ideas about us being information organizers and then going back and offering it back into the field. So if you can kind of picture a volcano as like throwing yourself in a volcano to become immortal back in the thing, would actually, there's a certain sense to it if you imagine it as the volcano being the top of the torus to be thrown back into the system. So anyway, so that was my little ontopoetic thing about Quora and remembering the insurance company and the RV with the virtual reality meditation and using children as channels. And, it's complicated. It's not these things that are simple and contiguous and expected and like everybody else. It's not like nothing you would ever imagine. I mean, I can't imagine that I even actually have to talk about this stuff, but I'm sorry, I keep having like things in my glasses. Yeah, I can't imagine that I have to talk about this, but I do. Yeah, so look into Fritz Perls. And I'm not saying he's a bad guy. Like he was trying to figure out the operating system, just like Michael Levin, right? And Lewin, but they were part of this milieu. And a lot of it will be, again, wellness, if they were looking at trauma and mental health. And of course, that's what Palantir and these mental health social impact bonds with UCSF were about, is mental health. But once you get into the mental health and the wearables and the telehealth and the AI assistance, then you've got a channel, and then you're getting all sorts of signals through tokens to parse for patterns. And so it seems to me that there's something at a higher level that's doing the perceiving of these patterns, which is something that Pranab Das was talking about with the Templeton stuff, is that there would be this AI that would parse the patterns. And so like the AI would be looking at the Gestalt. And so to me, this seems like something that we have to understand what is going on. And I will also just mention that Fritz Perls so he was closely connected to Esalen. He collaborated with Ida Rolf, who was doing, sort of intense body work. And at the end of his life, he started a Gestalt-themed community on Vancouver Island in Lake Cowichan, but I think he died like the next year, so it didn't get very far. But if I'm talking about, I've raised this idea of J.D. Bennett, the Gurdjieff protege, and his idea of psychokinetic communities and intentional communities. And I do need to get back to some ideas about community currencies and intentional community, and where things are going with some of these Schumacher community currency programs, and how that would relate to intentional community and the psyche and the body as a communication vehicle, both individually and collectively. But yeah, so I guess that just wraps it up. But just to summarize, I wanted to talk about Christiana Figueres of Costa Rica, whose father was married to a woman who had connections to Quakers in Costa Rica, who went to Swarthmore, studied at the Gestalt Institute of Cleveland, is setting up sort of the carbon trading, and that'll be the core of the circular economy, as a signal within an organismic intelligence at different scales, and then how this relates to this Gestalt idea of perception, pattern recognition, group evolution, and how we perceive ourselves. And that if we're taking in the pattern, there's always more to it, right? And so what I'm asking is, if you encounter something, just use this thought experiment of the profiles in the vase, that if you're reading something and it's the profile, right, you're reading it and it's all about the military and automation and top-down control and pandemic preparedness and public health, just pause for a second and see what's not there, because what's not there is this piece in the middle that may be just as significant as the piece you're initially meant to look at. And so it's not actually hidden, the other piece. The piece that I'm trying to talk about, which is pay for success finance and cybernetic governance, and us as agents with liquid democracy and ubiquitous spatial computing, and quote unquote, like empowering our human potential through personalized data streams that we control and we get our UBI and our harmony on and stuff like that. And that's connected into some sort of interdimensional information organization channeling scenario. I'm not saying that's good. Let me restate. I'm not saying that I approve of that, but I'm saying that is the other story, and that attached to Medicare, attached to Medicaid, attached to SNAP and WIC and the food systems. These are the things with Bobby as Health and Human Service guy and the Make America Healthy Again that needs further interrogation. I think the deep state military stuff, while it's true, is somewhat old hat, and it keeps you looking at one thing without expanding your view. And so just consider that when you're consuming content, is it's not saying that one thing is right and one thing is wrong, but is there more that you're not seeing because the channels you're tapped into are focused on keeping you afraid and traumatized, because afraid, traumatized populations that reinforce one another aren't going to be very flexible in dealing with new things that arise that might not be the storyline they were expecting. It might hit you from the side and you're just not even expecting to see it. So anyway, I'm going to go make some pizza. All right, good night. Okay, so we're here on Blake Street in downtown Denver. As I was looking for places to do field work here in the Colorado area, I had a friend alert me to the fact that actually Palantir had relocated its headquarters from the Bay Area here to Denver. And it's the building behind us. The address given on their website says Suite 250. So it's sort of low key, given the scope of Palantir in larger government, accounting, and geopolitical frameworks, because I feel like they're going to play a significant role in sort of the ubiquitous surveillance, tracking, social impact space. But yeah, again, it's very low key. And I was mentioning to Jason as we walked up, I'm like, it's kind of a small building. And he made the point that really, discrete is probably what they're going for at this point. And like the future of work is that you're working from your sofa or your kitchen table, not actually in a physical office. So, a huge organization like this could occupy a rather small footprint downtown rather than necessarily a big office complex sort of in the suburbs part of the city. So I thought that was an interesting observation. And then our next stop is going to be at the Capitol, and we're going to talk a lot about the state of Colorado and digital citizenship, digital government, and as it links to pay for success finance. But here for Palantir, I wanted to raise the issue that early on in my research around education, Santa Clara County, California, which is in the Silicon Valley area, was the test bed for a number of pay for success finance social impact bond deals. It was sort of a mixed bag. Some were strictly pay for success, some were formal social impact bonds. They included an early childhood social impact bond, an early literacy social pay for success deal, and then also 2 social impact bonds, one for homelessness and one for mental health. Those latter 2, the homelessness
social impact bond, which was called Welcome Home, and the mental health one, which was called Partners in Wellness. Within the pay for success finance space, you always have a third party that does the deal evaluation. So you have an arrangement between investors, the public agencies, and then there are supposed to be certain target metrics hit in order to fulfill the terms of the deal. And so in the case of both of those two, the homelessness and the mental health social impact bonds, Palantir was actually the third party reviewing. And if you understand Palantir's connections with State Intelligence, Defense Department, Homeland Security. One of their early funders was In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA. You can imagine how you have these vulnerable communities that need social supports, and then all of a sudden they become sort of sucked into this data vortex where their lives and behaviors become enmeshed in finance deals that are overseen by an entity that has very diverse interests, and many of them that are maybe at odds of just the general dispossessed poor person that needs the services. So, I wanted to bring that up. The other element, so Palantir does some of their work as pro bono. They have an philanthropy division, and they call it philanthropy engineering, right? And so, again, we're looking at sort of social progressivism, this continuation from the late 19th, earliest 20th century of engineered society to certain specifications. But right now, the specifications that society is going to be engineered to will be in alignment with investors, right? The BlackRocks of the world, the Vanguards of the world, the State Street Capital. Society will be reshaped to meet the needs of global capital. And Palantir is playing a role both in facilitating the assessment of the deals, but then also in implementing a larger state surveillance component that was going to be linked to your digital identity. So I want to mention, Peter, and I'm not sure if it's Thiel or Thiel, I'm not sure the correct pronunciation, Thiel, he was the founder of PayPal. And so a lot of what's going to be advancing moving forward is that my sense is that the pay for success deals will be linked in with conditional cash transfers. It might take the form of like a universal basic income or a cash payment system. But those payment systems, it's very obvious now that they're going to be digital. It's not going to be bills in your wallet. It's going to be digital credit on a phone or other smart device, or potentially in some future, some sensor that's in your hand, or biometric tattoo or something. And then the money in those systems can be programmed and linked to smart contracts to be used only for certain functions. Like, here's your public benefit, but you can use X amount for rent. You can use X amount for food. You can use X amount for reskilling. You can use X amount for mental health services. And you'll have very little autonomy in that equation, though there will likely be some, because these betting markets are going to be betting on your behavioral compliance. So the money that comes will be sort of monopoly money. And then that's sort of the starter money for the game of life. I will mention those social impact bonds that were happening in Santa Clara County, Partners in Wellness and Welcome Home, also had ties to the University of California, San Francisco medical complex. And so, we talked in Salt Lake City about the interface between predictive profiling of mental illness, of how that relates to social impact finance, social illness and addiction, how it meshes with the finance deals, and how it will mesh with wearable technology and potentially remote sensing technology, right? Because what they were doing at the Huntsman Center was they were planning to use these MRIs to sort of tease apart the neurons to identify whether you were prone to depression or schizophrenia or addiction. They were looking to get very nuanced data to fund these deals tied to mental health. So in my mind, that's a problem when what we're doing is we're playing a giant game. Now, I will say the year or so before the lockdown started, one of the first deployments of digital identity in this country happened in Austin, and it was part of the ID 2020 program. Everyone has a good digital identity, good ID, that's backed by Pierre Omidyar. That program was called MyPass in Austin. It was funded by the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies. Bloomberg is also active in the Pay for Success finance space here in Denver. And so what they did was they put unhoused people on blockchain for their medical records. And in that case, it was not high tech. It was simply that each person had their biometrics taken and they were assigned like a laminated card QR code that would represent them digitally as a citizen. So it doesn't have to be something as fancy as like they're going to put a chip in your hand. It could really be something as simple as a laminated QR code, which now like we've all started to become accustomed to, that's where things are moving. So I think we need to consider that in light of pay-for-success finance deals, the kind that Palantir was involved with. And here in Denver, they actually have a pay-for-success deal for the homeless, and it's connected to both Housing First services and something called assertive community treatment. And I'm not totally familiar with that, but that's an interesting name, assertive community treatment. There was an article on this in the Urban Institute's website, and partners included the Denver Foundation, the Python Foundation, now Gary Investments, the Walton Family Foundation, John and Laurel Arnold Foundation. Now again, John Arnold was Enron, Energy's futures trading, and he actually got caught in Baltimore doing sort of illicit deals with the city council to do surveillance flights of the city tied to predictions around crime. So that's part of that. Living Cities, that's a Rockefeller program tied to smart city development. The Nonprofit Finance Fund, which was very central in all of the Santa Clara deals with George Overholtzer. Colorado Health and Northern Trust. So there's multiple partners in that. Harvard Kennedy School was providing technical support, as well as Colorado Access, which I understand is Colorado's sort of Medicaid health system. Services were provided by Corporation for Supportive Housing and Enterprise Community Partners. And the payer on that deal was the City and County of Denver. It was about a 5-year program that was starting in 2016. So again, Housing First is a model where you people who are in crisis, you get them in housing, and then you try to take care of their needs, which on the surface, I don't have a problem with. But if what we're building is potentially smart housing with sensors, with conditional money, with non-consensual services provided to people, where there's surveillance involved and where those people then become commodities in global markets, that becomes a problem. I think that ethically, that's a huge problem. Then what we have is poverty and trauma that creates money for the wealthiest people in the world. And that's not going to fix the problems. If you have profitable poverty management, you're simply going to grow more poverty. So, Palantir's role in all of this, if they continue with what they had done in Santa Clara County, will be to assess those deals and possibly provide impact data, I'm assuming, to fulfill them. Now, earlier, maybe like 3 years ago, there was a program that set up opportunity zones, and every governor was supposed to identify 20% of its low-income census tracts to be identified for these opportunity zone areas. And they were for redevelopment. Essentially, it was a way for global financial interests to come in and gentrify huge swaths of land, make investments in both real estate and businesses. And these could include NGO service providers like charter schools, maybe like wellness providers, counseling, various companies. And if they could hold their investment for for 10 years, they would never pay capital gains tax on their original investment, which is a huge windfall. And these are like portfolios. It's really only these really big companies that have the resources to like sit on their investment for 10 years, but they totally can do that. So they can come in, remake whole neighborhoods. There are no protections from gentrification for the local people. And this is very much connected with the Federal Reserve's redevelopment programs, both community development of infrastructure and human resource development tied to reskilling. So in 2019 in Philadelphia, our Federal Reserve office, led by Patrick Harker, with our former mayor, Michael Nutter, who's a Bloomberg What Works government guy, they came together with this Pathways to Prosperity program. I'm gonna wait until it goes. Okay, so there is this Pathways to Prosperity program, which was essentially reskilling workers into things like commercial laundries, or they were partnered with Comcast, which is the telecom provider, because someone has to do the wiring for the metaverse and the surveillance state. And so they were reskilling. Now this was pre-lockdowns, right? Many people of the middle class losing their jobs in the lower class, and then having to reskill for the fourth industrial revolution. So the central banks interconnected with the opportunity zones are really, really central. And probably a lot of this redevelopment is going to be linked to smart systems, a smart infrastructure. They will come into low-income communities, probably like level it out, and then just start from scratch and rebuild what essentially might sort of be like friendly gulags, right, of social impact support systems. And so it's interesting here in Denver, there's an area that's sponsored by Panasonic. It's out near the airport. It's on the border of sort of a large opportunity zone on the east side of the city. And this Pena Center is on a transit hub. They're piloting autonomous vehicles, piloting smart pavement, piloting smart street lights that they've said will advertise to you based on your personal profile. And Panasonic did a previous city outside of Tokyo. So you can imagine that these opportunity zones would be remade specifically with supportive housing or mental health or services involved, but it's going to be conditional. It's going to be conditional on your behavioral compliance, and it's going to be tied in with programmed money and your QR codes, which we'll talk about later, but your digital identity, and Colorado is coming up with its own your identity on a smartphone, with you having to show proof of things like your health status in order to access parts of society. And I can imagine these zones, these opportunity zones, will be test beds. The homeless, people who have mental illness, will be early pilots for this. This will be profitable, and they will work out the kinks for the larger program, and that they will then apply to smart cities, charter cities, special economic zones. Essentially, with geofencing, it's the Wild West. You can just carve out parts of a city, and companies can take it over and do whatever they want in there. And that's where we're at. So anyway, new low-key headquarters of Palantir behind me in downtown Denver. All right, so this is our final field visit of this round. We're on the steps of the state capitol of Colorado. And before I get into all of that, I had a couple things that I forgot in the last video to mention about Peter Thiel and Palantir. One is that Thiel has been identified in recent years as sort of a political rainmaker for the Republican Party. Which is interesting to me because, he's a Silicon Valley guy, and on the surface, it doesn't necessarily seem to be, a great match with the Republican Party. But I think it's important to understand that moving forward, the whole technological social engineering element that's advancing, tied to digital identity and what works government, they really need the conservatives on board, because really the last 2 years have shown that the liberals and the progressives don't get that the underpinning of these social impact markets is really very devious and not meant to actually help people. They just listen to the superficial dialogue, that's on your local NPR station, right? And that's on the liberal media, and they believe and trust people that somehow, despite these terrible power imbalances and the rollout of this militarized technology, that things are going to improve for vulnerable populations. And I can't begin to explain why they think that is, but there's been no indicator over the last 2 years that the progressive liberal left is going to come along anytime soon. So they've got that pretty much locked up for the moment. And then you've got the conservatives who are still framing everything within the context of liberation and deregulation, and and they're the ones who are mostly asserting sort of buffer zones against the rising biosurveillance state, but they are doing that from a frame that's not one that I share necessarily. I mean, they're doing probably the correct thing for reasons that I'm not really aligned with. So they need educating, but essentially the biosurveillance state needs to pull in the conservatives. And so then in that context, I think it makes sense that Peter Thiel is being that rainmaker at the moment, and that there's such an emphasis within the blockchain and crypto space to be going after red states or sort of purple states like Colorado, states like Wyoming, Montana, Utah, get them on board with this understanding that somehow these decentralized technologies are going to preserve their rights and their access to free markets. When really the free markets are not going to be for your everyday person, it's going to be free markets for AI-driven hedge fund portfolios. That's who the free markets are going to be for. So I just wanted to sort of get that clear. Oh, and one last thing is that Peter Thiel actually purchased he has multiple homes in multiple places, but he did purchase an $18 million mansion in Miami last year. And Miami, in Florida in general, and Miami specifically, are very much aligned with the crypto blockchain space. As is Colorado, like every, different nodes are prominent, but the Learning Economy Foundation, their test lab for digital education and human capital finance, one of the test beds is here, C Lab in Colorado, and then the other one is actually in Broward County, which is sort of just outside of Miami. So Miami is sort of the crucible for a lot of the blockchain space and a launching pad for what's happening in Central America and Latin America in that space. So that's sort of just a continuation on the my last visit. So the thing that I talk about a lot that most people don't is this pay for success finance. And I'm sure a lot of people might be like, yeah, it's just one of like so many different kinds of legislation out there. Like, why is this piece important? It doesn't seem that important to me, given all that's underway. And, I gave a speech last summer in Tucson about smart cities and social impact finance and Internet of Things sensors, and how really what appears to be underway is the creation of a mixed reality video game where poor people are used as game pieces in this global financial market. And then ultimately the data will be used to attempt to catalyze the singularity and train the robots and perhaps feed into this, Julius Stillman's World Institute Global Brain Project, as crazy as it sounds, that appears to be the way it's going. So pay for success is the parameters linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and digital identity. That's the through line. So the UN SDGs are the goals, that those are the rules of the game, and pay for success are sort of the terms of engagement in the game. And then we've got the digital identity that identify you as a character in the game. And so pay for success finance has to happen first. Those policies, the enabling legislation has to happen. The Social Impact Partnerships Pay for Results Act, that gave seed money to start that going. And here in Colorado, Pay for Success legislation was passed in 2015. I think they initially started in 2014, they got some pushback, and then they moved to 2015. So that passed, and I'll just read off the representatives who were attached to that bill: Garnett and Rankin, Arndt, Becker, Duran, Fields, Hammer, Lee, Contine, Moreno, Pabin, Rosenthal, Roop, Salazar, Thurlow, Vigil, Williams, Winter, and Hullinghorst. And those are the reps. And then the senators were Johnston, Martinez, Humerick, Aguilar, Heath, Hill, Kefalas, Kerr, Scheffel, and Kaldman. And then it was signed into made active by Governor Hickenlooper at the time. And a major force behind that legislation were a group that were identified as Democrats for Education Reform. And in the hat that I was wearing early in my activism, I would say, these are people who want to privatize public education. But what I'm realizing is that really it's about turning vulnerable populations into these impact commodities, and this includes children. So as much as we were positioned to fight the education privatizers at the time, it's not really a fight between parents of charter schools and parents of public schools and parents of Catholic schools, because ultimately, through digital identity and choice vouchers and standardized curriculum, the plane will be leveled across the board, and all of the children will become these impact commodities trained to be digital citizens of the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So it's important to know that Jared Polis, when he was still a senator, he was the one, there's an article from America Forward that was asserting getting pay for success provisions into the reauthorization of the ESEA, and that's the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that's vital. It feels like somewhat of a small footnote off to the side. But once that was embedded, now the whole education system, as well as support services around the community schools model, they can tap into children and pull them into the data dashboards and their families into the data dashboards when it comes to health services and mental health services and social support services like, food assistance and housing that are being run through the schools. And that was done in a very intentional way, because when the data for the impact deals is collected in school settings, under FERPA, the Family Education Privacy Protection Act, it's much less protected actually than HIPAA, which is the health equivalent. So if this data was for mental health or other health services were collected in an out-of-school, informal institutional setting, they would be much better protected. So they need to pull all of that stuff into the school-based settings, or what is going to pass as school once they close down all the schools and turn it into anytime, anywhere learning. In 2017, there was a call by the state government of Colorado for innovative solutions for various nonprofits and stakeholders in the state to advance different kinds of evidence-based solutions for target populations, which at that time included child welfare-involved youth and youth that had been part of juvenile detention programs. So that was happening. Now, a major player in this space is something called Gary Community Ventures. It's led by Mike Johnston, who was a Colorado state senator between 2009 and 2017. He's an alum of Teach for America, and actually he helped found a small school in Thornton that was advancing something called an expeditionary learning model, which for most people who are stuck in, sit down with a Chromebook in a plexiglass cube and do your work, this standardized boring curriculum, like an expeditionary learning model seems like a dream, right? And what most people are understanding is that the intention was you create the problem and then you offer your solution. And so once they get digital identity and wearable technology and smart environments to the point that they have them, that project-based learning out in the environment will get them the next layer of data that they need. So it may seem like a wonderful option, but in reality, it's just creating opportunities for even more intense surveillance of children, digital surveillance, but just in new ways, not necessarily on your tablet or Chromebook. Now, this Gary Community Ventures, it was founded by Sam and Nancy Gary. Sam came came out west in the 1950s looking to make a fortune in oil, and he did at the Bell Creek oil field in Montana. He started his philanthropy in 1976, which was originally called the Piton Foundation, and they were focused on social welfare programs and land conservation. So they were doing urban land conservancy, the Denver preschool program, a campaign for children, Colorado children, and then later children's healthcare access. And a lot of the social impact finance space is going to be linked to Medicaid and Medicare and provision of services, but again, as data commodities. So on the website of Gary Community Ventures, where Mike Johnston is currently the CEO, they have been working hard with Governor Polis with his support around something called House Bill 22-1295. And the idea, there you go, Internet of Things, Internet of Bodies, mobility solutions, but conditional if you have your proper QR code. So this House bill is essentially meant to combine all of the early childhood systems into one department. And that's important because they need consolidation to advance the pay for success deals in early childhood. So this is called Better Beginnings Colorado, and I think it's moving forward in March of 2022. On the website of Gary Community Ventures, there's quite a lot of many stories about vaccination in schools, very much in line with the biosurveillance state. They also talk about absenteeism, which is a social impact market. They talk about social mobility of families, also an impact market, and school readiness impact market. So they've got all of these impact markets lined up. And I just want to say, when I was doing some work around sort of this ideal of the one world religion, or sort of this umbrella religion, because to take over the entire world from space as sort of this soft global coup, it's likely going to happen not in a giant militant, military engagement, but they want people just to yield themselves up to it. So it's going to be framed as peace and social justice and love, right? But with data under surveillance. I mean, they're not going to tell you that part. But so I was doing some research, and because of Ervin Laszlo, that Hungarian systems theorist I keep talking about, who is connected with Julia Stolman of the World Institute and the Global Brain Project, that Ervin Laszlo was connected with the Baha'i faith, and that's a faith that came out of Persia in the early 19th century, and it combines science and religion. And so what Laszlo has said is that the Baha'i, that's going to be the religion moving forward because of its emphasis on science, and so faith, but specifically steeped in the scientific method. And so it's when you look in the origins of Baha'i here in the United States, actually one of the earliest providers was supporters and financial supporters was Phoebe Hearst. Phoebe Hearst was the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron, and her husband was a California senator who had made a bunch of money in mining the Black Hills. So Phoebe Hearst, her background, and this is how it all ties in, back to the 19-teens, and this is this long arc, is that she was the founder of the Parent-Teacher Association in the United States, and she and her colleagues were very active around kindergarten. And so, again, at one point in time, I would say, yes, of course, funding kindergarten, full kindergarten funding is an imperative, and we should have that. But knowing what I know about the metaverse and Human Plus and where all of this is headed, really they need to condition the children from these earliest ages. So Head Start, pre-K, kindergarten. And this ties in with the early childhood better beginnings, like better beginnings for what? And I think all of us who, listen to our NPR stations and, read the newspapers, the impact media newspaper stories, think, well, it's better beginnings because we care about children, right? They're not thinking better beginnings because BlackRock needs their portfolio assets put in place. Nobody's thinking about that. They're not thinking, these better beginnings come with surveillance play tables for kids in Head Start, which is happening with EduCare in North Tulsa, in other areas that they're not thinking better beginnings means tracking the social behavior of young children to manage them as human capital into this future of automation and remote robotic work. Nobody's saying when we say better beginnings, we actually mean this, right? And so I think that's really important to consider. So that's Gary Investments. So the other thing is, when we were talking about the game, I wrote a long article focused on Mexico, which is where I think these policies were initially trialed in the early 1990s with Mexican officials, but they were trained in the US at Boston University and at Yale around conditional cash transfer payments. And so this was money, government assistance offered to particularly targeting poor women and their children. And the idea was, economic mobility or providing some stability. But it was conditional, and it was conditional with what was established as good parenting linked to provision of education and provision of health services and wellness visits. And essentially what had happened then is that the whole family gets pulled into the program and comes under surveillance. And whereas in the early to late 1990s, the cloud-based computing, the blockchain digital identities were not in place, that was starting to become normalized. And now these programs have spread to 40 countries covering millions upon millions of low-income women. Now there's no imperative to actually say, wait a minute. The stuff that we're doing globally around this economic structure and debt finance and saddling the countries in the global south with all of this debt and keeping them from being able to be make their own way, that's the problem. And why are these women poor in the first place? It's not because they're not interested in having opportunities to support their family in a reasonable way. It's that it's structured poverty. It's structured that way on purpose, and those women are made dependent on purpose. And I keep saying the frame for me is the indigenous genocide here in North America and the wild, wild west, and the intention of relocating people onto reservations so that they could not support themselves and their cultural practice. So this program of conditional cash transfers is something I hear very few people talking about, even though a lot of folks out there are talking about social control through digital currency. they're picturing like themselves, their middle class, professional class families in their suburban homes are going to be controlled. And that may very well be the case, but it's going to start with the poor first. It's going to start with people who are unhoused, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, and poor women and children. And those children is what they're after. And I hate to say it, like I wish the world were different and I didn't have to sit here outside this Capitol and say that. But I can't come to any other conclusion looking at how it's playing out and knowing Palantir is coming to Denver, that Peter Thiel's whole background is in digital payment systems. And so it's important to know that, so in Philadelphia, there's something called the Benefits Data Trust. And it sounds lovely, right? Like we provide navigators to connect people with the public benefits that they're entitled to, because maybe you're an older person and you don't know how to work the system, you can't get online, you don't know what benefits are available to you. And but it's much bigger than that. They tell a story up front, but they have a much deeper program behind it. And so the people who are behind this Benefits Data Trust, which was launched in 2005, so that's a couple years before the Global Impact Investment Network and in social impact investing started to scale through the Rockefeller Foundation. And remember, at that time, Judith Rodin was running it, and she was the former president at Penn. So a lot of this is embedded in Philadelphia, where I live, and many of the connections are specific to Philadelphia. But Colorado is another participant in this program. It's through the Colorado Health Foundation, and their pilot program in 2015 was food assistance to low-income seniors. And people would, and in Philadelphia, like the assistant was, heat assistance for low-income seniors, or training, this is our nudge unit, training social workers to be, have better training to deal with intake of the homeless, right? And that was all of the stuff. And it was about water bills, actually. Here, we're gonna create systems that, enable seniors to connect with reduced water bill payments. And you imagine, like, how could anyone say that's wrong, right? They pick the things up front. You're like, how can anybody say that's wrong? But they're not talking about conditional cash transfers and the larger incursions on people's family and culture and what that will mean. So these are some of the partners in the Benefits Data Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ballmer Group, and that's Steve Ballmer, formerly of Microsoft, and his wife is Connie, is part of Strive Together. That's that cradle to career pathway, right? So if you want the access to those benefits, you better get on the pathway and walk the walk. The Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, that's Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan, Kaiser Permanente, the health system. They're also deeply involved in pay for success finance, especially around housing. The United Way, they run the poverty management program called ALICE for the working poor, assets limited, income constrained employed. That's Alice. The Robin Hood Foundation, which is Paul Tudor Jones, and he worked with Stanley Druckenmiller, essentially spending the last 30 years setting up all of the infrastructure of this as a test bed in Harlem, the Harlem Children's Zone, and Walmart. And again, we've had that conversation in Salt Lake City about Sam Walton and Walmart and his time, at Fort Douglas and supply chains and what all of that means. So, these are the people who want to help, right? But to what end? To what end? That's what I'm saying. So that's the conditional cash transfer. So in 2017 here in Colorado, there was a pre-K social impact bond for with the Westminster Public Schools, which was identified as a low-income school district. The Walton Family Foundation in the Peyton Foundation, now Gary Investments, provided this funding for 112 4-year-olds to participate in pre-K. Now, again, if you look at the Salt Lake City Granite School District's social impact bond that was backed by Goldman Sachs, of the 100 children who were screened into the program, only one of them needed special education services at kindergarten enrollment, a number that the New York Times and many people in the philanthropy space said, that's a really sketch number. Like that actually doesn't make sense. But Goldman Sachs made a lot of money off the backs of those children. And increasingly what we're seeing is online preschool. And this is this Waterford Upstart program that we've seen in Philadelphia. So keep your eyes out because it's connected to the Sorensen family in Salt Lake City. So these social impact bonds are already happening here in Colorado. In 2019, Hickenlooper had support for these pay for success deals for at-risk teens. Remember, 2 years previous, they did sort of an open open call for innovative solutions from stakeholders and nonprofits. House Bill 1323 allocated $6 million in public funding, and then there was private funding from Laura and John Arnold and Annie E. Casey Foundation. Now, the Annie E. Casey Foundation has close ties to UPS. It's based in Baltimore. It's a very Catholic charity. Connie, it's connected with Strive Together as well, the Cradle to Career Pathways. And then John Arnold, I mentioned before, former energy futures trader, and that he was the one who was, cutting deals to do aerial surveillance of Baltimore as part of his sort of Better Bail projects and making predictive analytics about crime. And it was covert. It was nothing that the community had buy-in to. They didn't know about it till after it happened. So these are the people who are essentially monitoring or providing solutions for at-risk teens. Now, there were other partners in the program. University of Colorado Denver's Barton Institute for Philanthropy and Social Enterprise, because the academics are all part of this public-private partnership, and the UC Denver Center for Effective Interventions, right? So it's all about evidence-based and what works. And, that's what pulls in the conservatives, because on this is advancing fully bipartisan. So on the left-leaning side, you have people say, okay, well, those in need are being taken care of, right? And then the conservatives say, well, we're willing to pay for it, but only if you can prove that it works. But the what works part means that the people who are delivering the services and the people who are receiving the services have to be under digital surveillance. And whatever supports they receive have to be able to be scaled, which means it's digital. It means it's totally digital. So among the solutions, and there's also, there's the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab and Social Impact Solutions. So they were helping structure the deals. One of the cohorts was focused on Jefferson County foster care youth. And the program that was funded was called MST, Multisystemic Therapy. Okay, so you picture that you have, so some of these are foster care kids, and some of them are kids who have been involved in the judicial justice system, right? Some of it is aligning these youth to alternative training and workforce readiness. And again, those are all human capital markets. And again, those children will be directed to build the metaverse, very likely, or perhaps some sort of biotech job or some sort of cyber tech security job, or possibly alternative energy. Those seem to be the areas that people are funneled into. But then also there's the mental health treatment aspect, which touches again on being at Palantir. So this MST therapy is a mental health therapy, and it actually, if you follow it back, it was used in Essex County, England, in the UK in 2013. Okay, and it is a cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, CBT therapy lends itself to digital interventions, like a CBT therapies in VR headsets, conditioning. They're not going to pay for you to have talk therapy with a trained licensed professional. They're going to create some sort of digital intervention or digital nudge or digital training program that they're going to literally program you so that they can get their data for their deal. And that's just the reality. If we accept Pay for Success Finance as this new public-private partnership paradigm, that's how it's going to happen. So MST started in the UK. It was connected to the Government Outcomes Lab, and most of the mental health in the NHS in the UK goes back to Richard Layer's equation around depression, and putting sort of a quantification on, you will provide therapy to someone based on lost economic productivity. Like, not because they're human beings and they deserve it, but you will use the lost economic productivity of mental illness to create the cost offset for these deals. Now, the consultant for this MST therapy, his name is Stephen Goldberg, and he is now with Caffeinated Capital, which is quite the name, but he was the first managing director of social finance, and that's Ronald Cohen, the father of impact investing and Harvard MBA alum. And in 2017, Goldberg actually wrote a paper called Scale Finance, Industrial Strength Social Impact Bonds for Mainstream Investors. Now, does that sound like something that's coming out of a caring place? Like, we care about people's needs? We care about preschoolers? We care about fathers? No. Let me just repeat this. He says, scale finance, industrial strength social impact bonds for mainstream investors. They're looking to scale it, all right? That's what's coming. Now, the other piece of this, are you all right? is, it's cold here today. We keep going in and out of the sun. The workforce development. Okay, so these are at-risk youth. We have a whole other category, which is training and reskilling, the lifelong learning model on the blockchain. And this will be C-Lab. This will be the Learning Economy Foundation, and it feeds into something called the Colorado Swiss Apprentice Model. Now, this links Colorado to the state of Washington, and this goes through a woman. Her name is Suzanne Levine, and her husband Eric. Now, Suzanne was deeply involved in labor economics in the state of Washington, both in the employment office, in this Career Connect program, in Rework America. She was on the board of the Markle Foundation, which we talked about yesterday. She was involved in finance for the DNC, and she was a bundler for Obama. She was also the ambassador to Switzerland between 2014 and 2017, okay? So when we're talking about blockchain, that's where it all is, the Zug Crypto Valley in Switzerland. So she was very well attuned, I'm sure, to what was happening in the blockchain space in terms of digital badging and the next phase of globalization, which is the remote robotic labor and telepresence labor. Now, they're going to try to tell people that this apprenticeship model is sort of like what we imagined it, right? Like great, they're going to teach, kids good trades, right, that will help them earn a good living. They're going to have an up-to-date auto mechanic shop. They're going to have up-to-date carpentry, plumbing, and it will happen in schools with trained teachers who know how to work with kids. That's absolutely not what's going to happen. What they're going to do is they're going to put apprenticeship programs in VR headsets. And that's what's going to happen. And you're going to show your competencies. You're going to jump through the hoops. You're going to earn your badges. And you probably still won't get the job because there's 200 other people competing for that job. And it's very likely not going to be things that are actually useful to society. So they're counting on, when you say career and technical education, that most people are going to think about what they imagined when they were younger people, what it meant. That's not going to happen. That's going to be totally gutted. And the teachers are all working at cross purposes because they're not going to be teaching the CTE program. It's going to be mentors, and and some of those mentors are going to be AI and live in a device. Eric Levine, it's kind of odd. They were both with Microsoft, and then he moved on to found an app called Seller Tracker, which was for wine storage. So it's kind of an odd thing that he's doing career-wise planning in Colorado. But he was on the board of CareerWise and the American Swiss Foundation. The funders of CareerWise included the Department of Defense, Department of Labor, United Healthcare, United Way, Walton again, Markle again, the Opportunity Scholarships, Michael Bloomberg, and JP Morgan Chase. These people are in it for the money. The model was advanced by Hickenlooper in 2017, and at that time, Suzanne Levine issued with Switzerland a joint declaration of intent for vocational education. So guess what, Colorado? You're connected to Washington State and Switzerland now. This is moving through something called Skillful. Skillful is, as I mentioned yesterday, the Markle's program. It's connected to the Colorado Labor and Employment Division, CareerWise, Colorado Workforce Development Council. Their other partners include LinkedIn, Microsoft. Those are your stackable badges. Lumina, that's for betting on your outcome. For economic mobility, and Purdue. Now, Purdue University, it's important to note that they have the biggest online global university program out there. They also are host to the Sentient World Simulation with the digital twinning, and Melanie Swan, the crazy lady who's transhumanist and imagining that we're going to have blockchain nanobots run our neurons in our mind on blockchain. These are all in Purdue, right? So Purdue is a partner on this apprenticeship model, which people are thinking something like, oh, great, apprenticeships, like I can be a pastry chef. No, it's not that. It's not that at all. Walmart is also a partner. So one of the other states besides Colorado that's involved is the state of Indiana in Skillful. Now, I will just mention here, there's another program because people might imagine, well, how will pay for success work if the governments go bankrupt? Because ultimately, none of these people are paying taxes, and the governments will go bankrupt. The next phase is something called an impact security that was developed by NPX. One of the co-founders of that came out of Wharton as well, and they've been working on a pilot called The Last Mile, which trains incarcerated people while they are in prison to do coding. So essentially, the idea is that people will make more money in prison than they would doing other prison labor, and meanwhile, they can undercut the regular market in coding. So that Last Mile program started in San Quentin in 2017, has many major investors. There's organizations called Mission Measurement, Impact Genome. It's all tracking, again, heightened surveillance. And they call these impact securities performance-backed debt for NGOs, and they're all aligned with the environmental social governance. So we can imagine, essentially, the metaverse is not going to be built on properly waged labor. It's going to be built on free labor or subsidized labor, and that's kids, prisoners, poor women, and refugees. That's who they're going to get to the grunt work of coding the metaverse. Now, in order to track you in your digital credentials and your services and the impact, what they need is an interoperable database system, and they will sell it as private and decentralized, but they need to get you on the blockchain to make this happen. Colorado started something called a digital service in 2019. Jared Polis set it up. It's in the the Governor's Office of Information Technologies. And essentially they're there to provide digital services. And they're going to say something like, oh, it's super convenient. It's super convenient. But ultimately, it's about providing the accountability infrastructure for government contracts, for outcomes-based government contracting. Now, the departments that are involved in the state of Colorado are Personnel and Administration, Human Services, Labor and Employment, Public Safety, Public Health and Environment, Healthcare Policy and Finance, okay? So your wellness is all gonna be financed with Pay for Success. That puts you under surveillance with your step counts every single day. And e-health innovation, and that is your electronic health records on blockchain. And we talked a little bit about at the Anschutz Medical Campus. Okay, and so the outside partners include the U.S. Digital Response, the U.S. Digital Service, 18F with the General Services Administration, and that's tech and design consultancy, for the Beek Center for at Georgetown, which is social impact finance, Schmidt Futures, that's Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google Alphabet, and Code for Denver. Okay, so essentially, these are all folks who are going to sell you on the convenience of e-government and digital government. And of course, the lockdowns gave everybody a wonderful excuse to say, hey, you can't access us in person, but you can get us through a portal, right? You need your digital identity. That's where it's going. And so they had a link on their website for past work of this office. So I was curious, well, what were their projects? Well, the only project that was up was essentially managing the contact tracing for COVID, right? So it all goes back to like, getting you on the blockchain under the guise of like, if you're a healthy person, you're a national security risk. If you don't have some sort of digital sensor device that says you're okay, that's all part of it. So this feeds to, and I'm just sort of wrapping up here, but the Colorado Digital Identity Program. So, again, in the name of convenience, they're going to say, hey, you can just keep your driver's license on your phone, not to mention sometimes like your phone, battery dies or whatever. But that's the selling point. That was issued, the setup for that by Governor Polis by executive order B 2019-13. They're using it to regulate, you can use your digital ID for liquor purchases and marijuana. And so I was just telling Jason, like I feel really strongly that the legalization of marijuana and probably at some point sort of controlled psychoactive drugs will be linked to your digital identity, because the mental health system and the wellness, they will want to track the impact of these other kinds of medical uses into their impact deals, right? And so they need that tied to your digital identity. It's law enforcement, okay, and the Colorado State Patrol, that's no surprise, that meshes with the digital driver's license. But they're also looking, and then Department of Revenue, that's linked to your motor vehicle registration. But here we have Colorado WIC, which is, providing food for low-income women and infants. And that goes back to the conditional cash transfer I was talking about. They're regulating natural resources, so parks and fishing licenses. So if you can imagine in terms of the enclosures, they really want people to be dependent, and they want you not to be able to access things outside of these mega region areas, the smart city urban areas. So, I can foresee a day where instead of just the convenience of having your camping permit or your fishing license on your phone, that it's going to be a requirement. Like, you're not going to be able to get into public space without showing that you have the proper credentials, whatever they deem. And for now, they have a vaccine element on this phone. For now, maybe it's the vaccine, but in the future, who knows what other conditional elements you might have to earn the right to access these public spaces. So, and the last one, and this will sort of, I think, wrap us up, is the Mental Health Center of Denver has patient check-in. And, I'm just in closing saying, it's really hard to imagine, like, we're sitting here in these cities and on the surface they all seem so normal, but pretty soon it's going to not feel like, for many of us already, we don't feel normal in these spaces because we know it's underway. But the mental health crises that we had before the lockdowns of the past 2 years are going to be exponentially worse as more people are pushed out of jobs, as more people are put on pathways that don't feel right for them, that feel coercive, as we become colonized by more and more biotechnology and synthetic biology, both in our bodies and in our environments. They know that there's going to be a lot of mental health, and so they're building the impact markets around that, and they're going to create, my sense is, a lot of alternative wellness providers to service low-income populations and vulnerable populations that fall under this what works component. So, as I said, you fit all of this together, combined with what I said at the previous site visit about opportunity zones, special economic zones that they can create, sort of these digital company towns, sort of cordon up these communities and put them in essentially a digital game board. And I really, if you haven't watched my talk in Tucson about smart cities and this game, right, this mixed reality video game that is going to be coming with digital identity on blockchain to feed the global brain, pay for success finance, and privatize social services, privatize people. Seriously, my liberal and progressive and leftist friends, please understand that these public-private partnerships are turning the most at-risk people into pawns in something like, the game has already been underway. I mean, I think if you're a low-income person, you know that there's a shitty game out there, and you work through the paces and you hope to survive it, right? And a lot of people don't. But this thing that's coming, the level of coercion with ubiquitous computing, I think it's going to be beyond what we can even contemplate right now. And I don't mean to scare you, but I'm trying to come from the right place. I don't think any of us would want this, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. Even people who are on the conservative side, you wouldn't want to be having your public entities investing in the poverty of other people. You don't want to be a part of that either. People of faith don't want to be a part of that. If you just knew. And right now, it's spell casting what they're doing. They have very, very compelling propaganda to create enchantments that make people think that they're doing the right thing. Whether they're building the panopticon, or whether they're a service provider or navigator in it, or and I'm not sure how we neutralize this other than by awakening to the reality of it. So, Colorado is right in the center. There's some other states, we have friends in Texas. Texas is the center of this. Florida is the center for this. Wyoming is a part of it. Just in closing, I will say, my last thing about Colorado is that the largest digital identity deployment right now is in Ethiopia. It started off with students and teachers, so that would be in alignment with a lot of the pay for success finance that Polis put in the ESSA. But it's in Ethiopia, and this would be connected to education systems linked to the World Bank Human Capital Finance, UN Sustainable Development Goal 4, and that's happening through Cardano. And Cardano, Cardano Atala Prism, I think, is the component there. And Charles Hoskinson of Cardano, it lives in Guffey, Colorado. According to his LinkedIn, that's what it says. He's working with Carnegie Mellon University, and he's working with Hanson Robotics, and that's Ben Gertzel, that's Sophia and Grace, these humanoid robots that have a shared brain. That's this blockchain brain. And so as poor people, children, at-risk communities navigate this game, all of the data of being human in that game is going to be fed into the blockchain brain. And that's going to go through the impact data fulfillment, which is Ocean Protocol, that's in connection with SingularityNet, which is using AI to move data around to attempt to catalyze conscious machines. And I don't think that they'll actually be able to do that, because clearly machines are not going to have a soul. But I think that they're going to try really hard to capture that in people. And poor people are really resilient, and they're really creative. And that data is the data that they want for their robots, because they want to be able to figure out every different option in this asymmetrical warfare game that they're going to, wrap in, spun sugar and lollipops and rainbows and try to sell it to you. So just don't fall for it.